Most mornings began the same way. A pale gray sky hanging low above the rooftops. The quiet hum of an air conditioner somewhere down the block. Damp grass darkened by the night before. And you standing near the back door with a warm cup of coffee slowly cooling in your hands while the neighborhood drifted through those strange few minutes before the world fully wakes up. There was nothing unusual about it at first. Just another quiet morning in late October. A thin layer of fog sitting over the fences. Fallen leaves collecting near the edge of the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. But that morning, as you stepped down onto the wooden deck, you noticed a crow standing on the fence post beside the maple tree. Still, watching you. Its feathers looked almost blue in the early light, dark and smooth like wet ink. It didn't move when you opened the door. Didn't flinch when the screen creaked shut behind you. It only tilted its head slightly, one black eye fixed directly on you in a way that felt strangely deliberate. Most wild birds don't do that. They leave the second a person gets too close. Especially crows. And yet this one remained perfectly calm, claws wrapped around the damp wood of the fence as cold wind moved softly through the branches overhead. You remember glancing around the yard for a moment, almost expecting someone else to be standing nearby. But there was only silence. Just the sound of leaves dragging across the pavement somewhere down the street. Then the crow opened its wings slightly, paused, and folded them back again without flying away, as if it had decided something. And for reasons you probably couldn't explain even now, you felt that strange little shift in your chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the unsettling feeling that something had noticed you long before you noticed it. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because the things people have quietly experienced with birds for generations may change the way you look at the world outside your window. And this is where things slowly began to change. Because the strange part wasn't that the crow appeared once. It was that after that morning it kept coming back. After that first morning, you started noticing the crow in small moments that normally would have disappeared into the background of everyday life. Sometimes it was already there before sunrise, standing on the same fence post while the sky slowly turned silver behind the trees. Other times it waited on the telephone wire above the driveway, feathers shifting gently in the cold breeze as cars moved quietly through the neighborhood below. And somehow, without meaning to, you began looking for it too. That is usually how these things happen. Not all at once. Just little pieces of attention slowly attaching themselves to something you cannot fully explain. You would step outside carrying grocery bags after a long day and catch sight of that dark shape near the corner of the yard. Or you would sit alone on the back steps late in the evening while porch lights glowed softly across the street. And there it was again, watching from somewhere nearby, without making a sound. The strange part was not the bird itself. The strange part was how familiar the feeling became. Because most people have experienced moments like this at some point in their lives. A feeling that nature is reacting to them differently during certain seasons of their life. Especially during the quiet ones. During periods of grief, exhaustion, loneliness, or those difficult stretches where you move through the world pretending everything feels normal when deep down it does not. And maybe that is why moments like this stay with people for years. Because when a wild creature stops running from you, something inside you pauses too. You start noticing the wind moving through bare branches, the sound of distant wings overhead, the stillness between ordinary noises. And little by little, the world outside no longer feels entirely separate from the world inside your own mind. But the things that happened next made the pattern much harder to dismiss. At first, you probably would have explained it away the same way anyone else would. A smart bird getting comfortable around people. Nothing more than that. But over the next few weeks, small details began collecting around the experience in ways that felt harder to ignore. The crow did not behave the same around everyone. You noticed that almost immediately. Neighbors walked past the fence every day and it kept its distance from them, lifting off into the trees before they came too close. But with you it stayed, sometimes only 10 or 12 feet away. Calm, alert, watching. One cold morning, you stepped outside before dawn wrapped in an old gray sweatshirt, while rainwater still dripped slowly from the gutters. The crow was already there waiting on the railing beside the steps. Not searching for food, not making noise. Just studying you with that unsettling stillness crows seem to carry naturally. And this is the part many people never realize about birds like these. Researchers have quietly observed for years that crows can recognize individual human faces for an incredibly long time. Not only that, they react differently based on emotional memory and previous encounters. They remember who frightened them, who ignored them, who moved gently. Some studies even suggest they can detect tension in body movement before a person speaks at all. But standing there in the pale blue light of early morning, none of that felt scientific in the moment. It felt personal. Because there are certain experiences that seem too small to explain to other people without sounding foolish. The way an animal pauses when you are upset. The way silence changes around you during certain seasons of life. The strange feeling that something in nature is observing not just your actions, but your state of mind. And this was where the ordinary world slowly began opening into something deeper. By November, the mornings had become colder and quieter. Frost gathered along the edges of the fence posts before sunrise, and the trees behind the yard stood almost completely bare except for a few trembling leaves that refused to fall. The crow still appeared nearly every day, sometimes close enough that you could hear the faint scrape of its claws against the wood when it shifted its weight. And slowly, without realizing it, you began changing your own behavior around it. Your movements became softer, slower. You stopped slamming the back door. Stopped reaching for your phone the moment you stepped outside. Instead, you stood still in the cold air and listened to the neighborhood waking up around you. A truck engine somewhere down the street. Wind brushing through dry branches. The distant call of another crow far beyond the houses. Scientists have discovered something unusual about animals that survive close to humans for long periods of time. Many of them become extremely sensitive to patterns most people never notice. Breathing rhythm. Muscle tension, eye movement, tiny shifts in posture that reveal whether someone feels calm, anxious, distracted, or emotionally unsettled. Birds especially respond to predictability and nervous system cues long before conscious interaction even begins. And maybe that explains why certain people seem to draw wildlife closer without trying. Not because animals sense something supernatural, but because some humans carry a quieter presence than others. Less abrupt movement. Less noise inside themselves. Standing there one gray morning with cold air filling your lungs and the crow watching silently from only a few feet away, you could feel that possibility settling somewhere deep in your mind. Because the older you get, the more you begin to understand that trust in nature is never random. And what happened a few days later made that feeling even harder to ignore. The pattern became part of your mornings so gradually that it almost felt dangerous to acknowledge it out loud. Around 6:30 each day, just as the first week's sunlight touched the tops of the fences, the crow appeared somewhere near the yard. Sometimes on the railing beside the steps. Sometimes on the low branch hanging over the driveway where the last orange leaves still clung to the tree despite the cold. And eventually, without planning to, you began leaving the back door open a few extra seconds before stepping outside, as if some quiet part of you expected company. One morning, a thin layer of ice covered the grass and your breath drifted pale into the air while the neighborhood remained completely still. No lawn mowers. No traffic yet. Only the soft ticking sound of tree branches moving against one another in the wind. The crow landed only a few feet away beside an overturned flower pot near the deck stairs. Close enough now that you could notice the tiny details people rarely see. The faint silver edges hidden inside black feathers. The way its eyes reflected the gray morning light like dark glass. The careful little movements of its head whenever you shifted your weight. Neither of you moved for several seconds. And strangely, it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar. Almost like recognizing someone you had never actually met before. This is how emotional attachment often begins in nature. Quietly. Through repetition. Through presence. Through small moments that would sound meaningless if described too quickly. But standing there in the cold silence with that bird only a few feet away, you could feel something subtle changing inside you. The distance between observer and observed no longer felt entirely clear. And somehow, the crow seemed to sense that too. Then one morning, everything felt different before you even opened the back door. It was difficult to explain at first. The house itself seemed quieter somehow. The kind of silence that makes you stop for a second with your hand still resting on the doorknob. Outside, the sky hung low and colorless over the neighborhood, and a cold wind moved slowly through the trees without carrying any birdsong with it. That was the first thing you noticed. No sparrows in the hedges. No distant crows overhead. No fluttering movement near the power lines. Just stillness. You stepped onto the deck and immediately felt that strange pressure in the air people sometimes experience before a thunderstorm, even though the sky remained perfectly dry. The yard looked exactly the same as always. Frost near the fence. Bare branches shifting softly above the driveway. A few dead leaves scraping across the pavement. But the atmosphere felt emptied out somehow, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. And then you saw the crow. It was standing alone near the far corner of the yard beside the maple tree, unusually still even for a crow, watching the street instead of watching you. Its body, low, feathers pressed tightly against the wind. Many animals respond to environmental changes long before humans consciously recognize them. Tiny shifts in pressure, sound frequencies, electromagnetic disturbances, subtle behavioral cues moving invisibly through the natural world. Researchers have observed birds altering movement patterns hours before storms, earthquakes, and other changes humans could not yet perceive. But standing there in that unnatural silence, the scientific explanations only deepened the feeling growing in your chest. Because what unsettled you most was not the crow itself. It was the strange realization that your own body had sensed something was wrong moments before your mind could explain why. And what happened later that afternoon made that feeling almost impossible to forget. That afternoon, a heavy storm rolled through just after 3 o'clock. Dark clouds moved in fast from the west, swallowing the pale light above the neighborhood until the entire street looked dim and colorless beneath the rain. Tree branches bent sharply in the wind. Porch decorations rattled softly against front steps. And for hours afterward, you could not stop thinking about the silence that came before it all began. The crow returned the next morning as though nothing unusual had happened. Come again, perched quietly along the fence while weak sunlight reflected off puddles gathered near the curb. But something inside you had changed now. You no longer looked at the bird the same way. Because once a pattern begins attaching itself to emotion, the mind starts noticing connections everywhere. Many people believe animals sense things humans have forgotten how to hear inside themselves. Not supernatural messages exactly. Something quieter than that. Subtle shifts in emotion, intention, awareness. Researchers often describe intuition as the brain recognizing patterns beneath conscious thought before logic catches up. And perhaps that is why moments like these feel so strangely personal. Sometimes your body understands something before language ever reaches it. Standing there in the cold morning air, you found yourself wondering how many experiences throughout life had begun this same way. A feeling, a pause, a strange sense of knowing you could not fully explain. The crow lowered its head slightly and gave a single rough call into the empty street before lifting into the gray sky beyond the houses. And something about that moment felt difficult to ignore. Not because it proved anything impossible, but because it reminded you that the natural world may be paying far closer attention to human emotion than most people realize. And this next part was where the experience became even more personal. By the end of November, the trees behind the neighborhood had become almost completely bare. In the evenings, the sunset arrived earlier now, washing the fences and rooftops in that soft amber light that only lasts a few quiet minutes before winter darkness settles in. The crow still came nearly every morning. Not always close. Sometimes it stayed on the telephone wire above the street, feathers lifting gently in the cold wind while distant traffic moved beneath it like another world entirely. But even from far away, you could feel its presence immediately. And perhaps that was the strangest realization of all. Not that the bird recognized you, but that somewhere along the way, you had started recognizing it too. The sound of wings overhead no longer blended into the background. You noticed shadows crossing the yard now, tiny movements in tree branches, the sudden stillness that falls across a neighborhood just before sunrise. It was as though the experience had quietly adjusted your attention toward parts of the world you had stopped seeing years ago. Many people describe moments like this as coincidences. Others believe certain animals appear during periods of emotional transition because humans become more aware during difficult or reflective seasons of life. And maybe there is truth somewhere in both ideas. Because whether spiritual or instinctive, something about these encounters lingers long after the moment itself disappears. One evening, You stood alone near the back steps while freezing wind carried dry leaves across the pavement and the sky slowly darkened above the houses. The crow sat silently on the fence for several minutes without moving at all. No sound, no fear, just quiet recognition shared across the cold evening air. And in that stillness, you began to understand something subtle but deeply human. Sometimes the world feels less lonely when nature pauses long enough to notice you back. Winter arrived quietly after that. The kind of slow American winter where the mornings become pale and colorless and the trees stand motionless against long gray skies for weeks at a time. Some mornings the yard disappeared beneath a thin layer of frost that glittered softly beneath the porch light before sunrise. Other mornings, cold rain drifted through the neighborhood so lightly it almost looked like fog moving sideways through the air. And through all of it, the crow continued appearing without warning. Never predictable enough to feel ordinary. Never dramatic enough to feel unreal. Just present. Sometimes near the maple tree. Sometimes high above the streetlight at the end of the block. Always watching with that same unsettling calmness that had somehow become familiar now. Then one morning, it did not come at all. You waited longer than usual near the back steps with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee slowly cooling in the cold air. The yard remained completely still. Wind moved softly through bare branches overhead. Somewhere far away, another crow called once from beyond the neighborhood, but the familiar dark shape never appeared beside the fence again. And strangely, the feeling that stayed with you was not disappointment. It was gratitude, because by then, you understood the experience had never really been about a bird alone. It was about attention. About slowing down long enough to notice the invisible emotional currents moving quietly beneath ordinary life. Many people spend years disconnected from the natural world without realizing how deeply their minds and emotions still respond to it. But once something in nature looks back at you long enough, it becomes difficult to return to the way you saw the world before. Even now, months later, you still catch yourself pausing whenever you hear wings overhead in the early morning silence. You still glance toward the fence without thinking. And sometimes, during those quiet moments just before sunrise when the neighborhood has not fully awakened yet, it almost feels as though the world outside is listening too. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If experiences like this speak to something quiet inside you, subscribe before you leave, because there are still so many things moving through the natural world that most people never slow down enough to truly notice. And perhaps somewhere outside your window tonight, perched silently on a fence post or hidden among dark winter branches, something small and feathered is observing the world with far more awareness than we understand. Maybe it was only a bird, but it never felt like only a bird.